concerned, he took the boy to one of the practice rooms under the pretext of telling him about a minor musicological discovery. He had Joseph bring in and tune a clavichord, and involved him in a long tutoring session on the origin of sonata form until the young man somewhat forgot his anxieties, yielded, and listened, relaxed and grateful, to the master's words and playing. Patiently, the music master took what time was needed to put Joseph into a receptive state. And when he had succeeded, when his lecture was over and he had concluded by playing one of the Gabrieli sonatas, he stood up, began slowly pacing the little room, and told a story. Many years ago I was once much preoccupied with this sonata. That was during the period of my free studies, before I was called to teaching and later to the post of music master. At the time I was ambitious to work out a history of the sonata from a new point of view, but then for a while I stopped making any progress at all. I began more and more to doubt whether all these musical and historical researches had any value whatsoever, whether they were really any more than vacuous play for idle people, a scanty aesthetic substitute for living a real life. In short, I had to pass through one of those crises in which all studies, all intellectual efforts, everything that we mean by the life of the mind, appear dubious and devalued, and in which we tend to envy every peasant at the plough and every pair of lovers at evening, or every bird singing in a tree and every cicada chirping in the summer grass, because they seem to us to be living such natural, fulfilled, and happy lives. We know nothing of their troubles, of course, of the elements of harshness, danger, and suffering in their lot. In brief, I had pretty well lost my equilibrium. It was far from a pleasant state, in fact it was very hard to bear. I thought up the wildest schemes for escaping and gaining my freedom. For example, I imagined myself going out into the world as an itinerant musician and playing dances for wedding parties. If some recruiting officer from afar had appeared, as in old tales, and coaxed me to don a uniform and follow any company of soldiers into any war, I would have gone along. And so things went from bad to worse, as so often happens to people in such moods. I so thoroughly lost my grip on myself that I could no longer deal with my trouble alone, and had to seek help. He paused for a moment and chuckled softly under his breath. Then he continued. Naturally I had a studies advisor, as the rules require, and of course it would have been sensible and right as well as my duty to ask him for advice. But the fact is, Joseph, that precisely when we run into difficulties and stray from our path and are most in need of correction, precisely then we feel the greatest disinclination to return to the normal way and seek out the normal form of correction. My advisor had been dissatisfied with my last quarterly report. He had offered serious objections to it, but I had thought myself on the way to new discoveries and had rather resented his objections. In brief, I did not like the idea of going to him. I did not want to eat humble pie and admit that he had been right. Nor did I want to confide in my friends. But there was an eccentric in the vicinity whom I knew only by sight and hearsay, a Sanskrit scholar who went by the nickname of the Yogi. One day, when my state of mind had grown sufficiently unbearable, I paid a call on this man, whose solitariness and oddity I had both smiled at and secretly admired. I went to his cell intending to talk with him, but found him in meditation. He had adopted the ritual Hindu posture and could not be reached at all. With a faint smile on his face, he hovered, as it were, in total aloofness. I could do nothing but stand at the door and wait until he returned from his absorption. This took a very long time, an hour or 2 hours, and at last I grew tired and slid to the floor. There I sat, leaning against the wall, continuing to wait. At the end I saw the man slowly awaken. He moved his head slightly, stretched his shoulders, slowly uncrossed his legs, and as he was about to stand up his gaze fell upon me. "What do you want?" he asked. I stood up and said, without thinking and without really knowing what I was saying, "It's the sonatas of Andrea Gabrieli." He stood up at this point, seated me in his lone chair, and perched himself on the edge of the table. "Gabrieli?" he said. "What has he done to you with his sonatas?" I began to tell him what had been happening to me, and to confess the predicament I was in. He asked me about my background with an exactness that seemed to me pedantic. He wanted to know about my studies of Gabrieli and the sonata, at what hour I rose in the morning, how long I read, how much I practiced, when were my mealtimes and when I went to bed. I had confided in him, in fact imposed myself on him, so that I had to put up with his questions, but they made me ashamed. They probed more and more mercilessly into details, and forced me to an analysis of my whole intellectual and moral life during the past weeks and months. Then the yogi suddenly fell silent, and when I looked puzzled he shrugged and said, "Don't you see yourself where the fault lies?" But I could not see it. At this point he recapitulated with astonishing exactness everything he had learned from me by his questioning. He went back to the first signs of fatigue, repugnance, and intellectual constipation, and showed me that this could have happened only to someone who had submerged himself disproportionately in his studies and that it was high time for me to recover my self-control, arid to regain my energy with outside help. Since I had taken the liberty of discontinuing my regular meditation exercises, he pointed out, I should at least have realized what was wrong as soon as the first evil consequences appeared, and should have resumed meditation. He was perfectly right. I had omitted meditating for quite a while on the grounds that I had no time, was too distracted or out of spirits, or too busy and excited with my studies. Moreover, as time went on I had completely lost all awareness of my continuous sin of omission. Even now, when I was desperate and had almost run aground, it had taken an outsider to remind me of it. As a matter of fact, I was to have the greatest difficulty snapping out of this state of neglect. I had to return to the training routines and beginner's exercises in meditation in order gradually to relearn the art of composing myself and sinking into contemplation. With a small sigh, the magister ceased pacing the room. That is what happened to me, and to this day I am still a little ashamed to talk about it. But the fact is, Joseph, that the more we demand of ourselves, or the more our task at any given time demands of us, the more dependent we are on meditation as a wellspring of energy, as the ever-renewing concord of mind and soul. And, I could if I wished give you quite a few more examples of this. The more intensively a task requires our energies, arousing and exalting us at one time, tiring and depressing us at another, the more easily we may come to neglect this wellspring, just as when we are carried away by some intellectual work we easily forget to attend to the body. The really great men in the history of the world have all either known how to meditate or have unconsciously found their way to the place to which meditation leads us. Even the most vigorous and gifted among the others all failed and were defeated in the end because their task or their ambitious dream seized hold of them, made them into persons so possessed that they lost the capacity for liberating themselves from present things, and attaining perspective. Well, you know all this, it's taught during the first exercises, of course. But it is inexorably true. How inexorably true it is, one realizes only after having gone astray. This story had just enough effect upon Joseph for him to apprehend the risk he himself was running, so that he turned to his meditation exercises with renewed seriousness. What really impressed him was the fact that the master had for the first time revealed to him something of his personal life, of his youth and early studies. For the first time Joseph fully realized that even a demigod, even a master, had once been young and capable of erring. He felt gratitude, too, for the confidence the revered master had placed in him by making this confession. It was possible for one to go astray, to flag, to make mistakes, to break rules, and still to deal with all such difficulties, to find one's way back, and in the end even to become a master. Joseph overcame the crisis. During the 2 or 3 years at Waldsall during which the friendship between Plinio and Joseph continued, the school watched the spectacle of these combative friends like a drama in which everyone had at least some small part, from the headmaster to the youngest freshman. The two worlds, the two principles, had become embodied in Necht and Designori. Each stimulated the other. Every disputation became a solemn and symbolic contest which concerned everyone at the school. From every contact with his native soil on the holiday visits home, Plinio would bring back new energy, and from every withdrawal for reflection, from every new book, every meditation exercise, every meeting with the Magister Musicae, Joseph also derived new energy, made himself better fitted to be the representative and advocate of Castalia. As a child he had experienced his first vocation. Now he experienced the second. These years shaped and forged him into the perfect Castalian. He had also some time ago completed his elementary lessons in the glass bead game, and even then, during holidays and under the eye of a games director, had begun sketching out his own glass bead games. In this activity he now discovered one of the most abundant sources of joy and relaxation. Not since he had insatiably practiced harpsichord and piano pieces with Carlo Ferramonte had anything done him so much good, so refreshed, strengthened, reassured, and delighted him as did these first advances into the starry firmament of the glass bead game. During these same years young Joseph Necht wrote those poems which have been preserved in Ferramonte's copy. It is quite possible that there were originally more of them than have come down to us, and it may be assumed that the poems, the earliest of which dates back to a time before Knecht's introduction to the glass bead game, helped him to carry out his role and to withstand the many tests of those critical years. Here and there in these poems, some skillfully wrought and some hastily scribbled, every reader will discover traces of the profound upheaval and crisis through which Necht was then passing under the influence of Plinio. A good many of the lines sound a note of profound disturbance, of fundamental doubts about himself and the meaning of his life, until, in the poem entitled, The Glass Bead Game, he seems to have attained belief and surrender. Incidentally, a measure of concession to Plinio's world, an element of rebellion against certain unwritten laws of Castalia, is contained in the mere fact that he wrote these poems and even on occasion showed them to several schoolmates. For while Castalia has in general renounced the production of works of art, even musical production is known and tolerated there only in the form of stylistically rigid composition exercises. Writing poetry was regarded as the most impossible, ridiculous, and prohibited of conceivable acts. Thus these poems were anything but a game, anything but an idle calligraphic amusement. It took high pressure to start this flow of productivity, and a certain defiant courage was required to admit to the writing of these verses. It should also be mentioned that Plinio Designori likewise underwent considerable change and development under the influence of his antagonist. This was reflected in more than the refinement of his methods of argument. During the comradely rivalry of those school years, Plinio saw his opponent steadily rising and maturing into an exemplary Castalian. The figure of his friend more and more vigorously and vividly embodied for him the spirit of the province. Just as he himself had infected Joseph with some of the atmospheric turbulence of his own world, he for his part inhaled the Castalian air and succumbed to its charm and power. In his last year at the school, after a 2-hour disputation on the ideals and perils of monasticism, fought out in the presence of the highest glass bead game class, Plinio took Joseph out for a walk and made a confession to him. We quote it from a letter of Ferramonte's. Of course I've known for a long time, Joseph, that you are not the credulous glass bead game player and Castalian saint whose part you have been playing so splendidly. Each of us stands at an exposed spot in this battle, and each of us probably knows that what he is fighting against right Fufi exists and has its undeniable value. You yourself take the side of intensive cultivation of the mind, I the side of natural life. In our contest you have learned to track down the dangers of the natural life and have made them your target. Your function has been to point out how natural, naive living without discipline of the mind is bound to become a mire into which men sink, reverting to bestiality. And I for my part must remind you again and again how risky, dangerous, and ultimately sterile is a life based purely upon mind. Good, each defends what he believes to be primary, you mind and I nature. But don't take offense, it sometimes seems to me that you actually and naively consider me an enemy of your Castalian principles, a fellow who fundamentally regards your studies, exercises, and games as mere tomfoolery, even though he briefly joins in them for one reason or another. How wrong you would be if you really believed that, my friend. I'll confess to you that I am infatuated with your hierarchy, that it often enthralls me like happiness itself. I'll confess to you that some months ago, when I was at home with my parents for a while, I had it out with my father and won his permission for me to remain a Castalian and enter the order if this should be my desire and decision at the end of my school days. I was happy when he at last gave his consent. As it happens, I shall not make use of his permission. I've recently realized that. Not that I've lost my taste for it, not at all. But I more and more see that for me to remain among you would mean escaping. It would be a fine, a noble escape perhaps, but still an escape. I shall return and become a man of the outside world, but one who continues grateful to your Castalia, who will go on practicing a good many of your exercises, and will come every year to join in the celebration of the great glass bead game. Necht informed his friend Ferromonte of Plinio's confession with deep emotion. And Ferromonte himself added, in the letter we have just cited, to me, as a musician, this confession of Plinio, to whom I had not always been entirely fair, was like a musical experience. The contrast of world and mind, or of Plinio and Joseph, had before my eyes been transfigured from the conflict of two irreconcilable principles into a double concerto. When Plinio had come to the end of his 4-year course and was about to return home, he brought the headmaster a letter from his father inviting Joseph Nechayev to spend the coming vacation with him. This was an unusual proposal. Leaves for journeys and stays outside the pedagogic province did exist, chiefly for purposes of study. They were not so very rare, but were exceptional and generally granted only to older and more seasoned researchers, never to younger students still at school. But since the invitation had come from so highly esteemed a family and personage, Headmaster Zebiandin did not presume to reject it on his own, but presented it to a committee of the Board of Educators. The reply was a laconic refusal. The friends had to say goodbye to each other. We'll try the invitation again sometime, Plinio said. Sooner or later it will work out. You must someday see my home and meet my family, and realize that we are not just commercial-minded scum. I shall miss you very much. And make sure, Joseph, that you rise quickly in this complicated Castalia of yours. Of course you're highly suited to become a member of the hierarchy, but in my opinion more at the top than the bottom of the heap, in spite of your name. I prophesy a great future for you. One of these days you'll be a magister and be counted among the illustrious. Joseph gave him a sad look. Go ahead and make fun of me, he said, struggling with the emotion of parting. I am not so ambitious as you, and if I should ever attain to some office, you will long since have become president or mayor, university professor, or deputy. Think kindly of us, Plinio, and of Castalia, don't become entirely estranged from us. After all, there have to be a few people in the outside world who know more about Castalia than the jokes they make about us out there. They shook hands, and Plinio departed. For his last year in Waldsall, Joseph remained out of the limelight. His exposed and strenuous function as a more or less public personality had suddenly come to an end. Castalia no longer needed a defender. Joseph devoted his free time during that year chiefly to the glass bead game, which enthralled him more and more. A notebook of jottings from that period, dealing with the meaning and theory of the game, begins with the sentence, "The whole of both physical and mental life is a dynamic phenomenon, of which the glass bead game basically comprehends only the aesthetic side, and does so predominantly as an image of rhythmic processes." 3. Years of freedom. Joseph Necht was about 24 years old at this time. With graduation from Waldsall, his school days were over, and there now began his years of free study. With the exception of his uneventful boyhood in Eschholz, these were probably the most serene and happy years of his life. There is, after all, always something wonderful and touchingly beautiful about a young man, for the first time released from the bonds of schooling, making his first ventures toward the infinite horizons of the mind. At this point he has not yet seen any of his illusions dissipated, or doubted either his own capacity for endless dedication or the boundlessness of the world of thought. Especially for young men with gifts like those of Joseph Necht, who have not been driven by a single talent to concentrate on a specialty, but whose nature rather aims at integration, synthesis, and universality, this springtide of free study is often a period of intense happiness and very nearly of intoxication. Were it not preceded by the discipline of the elite schools, by the psychic hygiene of meditation exercises and the lenient supervision of the Board of Educators, this freedom would even be dangerous for such natures and might prove a nemesis to many, as it used to be to innumerable highly gifted young men in the ages before our present educational pattern was set, in the pre-Castalian centuries. The universities in those days literally swarmed with young Faustian spirits who embarked with all sails set upon the high seas of learning and academic freedom, and ran aground on all the shoals of untrammeled dilettantism. Faust himself, after all, was the prototype of brilliant amateurishness and its consequent tragedy. In Castalia, as it happens, the intellectual freedom of the student is infinitely greater than it ever was at the universities of earlier ages, since the available materials and opportunities for study are far ampler. Moreover, studies in Castalia are in no way restricted or colored by material considerations, by ambition, timidity, straitened circumstances of the parents, prospects for livelihood and career, and so on. In the academies, seminars, libraries, archives, and laboratories of the pedagogic province, every student is completely equal, no matter what his origins and prospects. The hierarchy grades the student solely by his qualities of mind and character. On the other hand, most of the freedoms, temptations, and dangers to which so many talented youths succumb at the secular universities simply do not exist in Castalia. Not that there is a dearth of danger, passion, and bedazzlement there. How could these elements ever be completely absent from human life? But at least certain opportunities for going off the rails, for disappointment and disaster, have been eliminated. There is no danger of the Castalian student's becoming a drinker. Nor can he waste the years of his youth in tomfoolery, or the empty braggadocio of secret societies, as did some generations of students in olden times. Nor is he apt to make the discovery someday that his degree was a mistake, that there are gaps in his preparatory education which can never be filled. The Castalian order of things protects him against such blunders. The danger of wasting himself on women or on losing himself in sports is also minimal. As far as women are concerned, the Castalian student is not subject to the temptations and dangers of marriage, nor is he oppressed by the prudery of a good many past eras which imposed continence on students or else made them turn to more or less venal and sluttish women. Since there is no marriage for the Castalians, love is not governed by a morality directed toward marriage. Since the Castalian has no money and virtually no property, he also cannot purchase love. It is customary in the province for the daughters of the citizenry not to marry early, and in the years before marriage they look upon students and scholars as particularly desirable lovers. The young men, for their part, are not interested in birth and fortune, are prone to grant at least equal importance to mental and emotional capacities, are usually endowed with imagination and humor and, since they have no money, must make their repayment by giving more of themselves than others would. In Castalia, the sweetheart of a student does not ask herself, "Will he marry me?" She knows he will not. Actually, there have been occasions when he did. Every so often an elite student would return to the world by way of marriage, giving up Castalia and membership in the order. But these few, rare cases of apostasy in the history of the schools and of the order amount to little more than a curiosity. After graduation from the preparatory schools, the elite student truly enjoys a remarkable degree of freedom and self-determination in choosing among the fields of knowledge and research. Unless a student's own talents and interests dictate natural bounds from the start, the only limit on this freedom is his obligation to present a plan of study for each semester. The authorities oversee the execution of FHIS plan in only the mildest way. For young men of versatile talents and interests, and Knecht was one of these, the scope thus allowed him is wonderfully enticing and a source of continual delight. The authorities permit such students, if they do not drift into sheer idleness, almost paradisiacal freedom. The student may dabble in all sorts of fields, combine the widest variety of subjects, fall in love with 6 or 8 disciplines simultaneously, or confine himself to a narrower selection from the beginning. Aside from observing the general rules of morality that apply to the whole province and the order, nothing is asked of him except presentation once a year of the record of the lectures he has attended, the books he has read, and the research he has undertaken at the various institutes. His performance comes in for closer check only when he attends technical courses and seminars, including courses in the glass bead game and at the Conservatory of Music. Here every student has to take the official examinations and write the papers or do the work required by the head of the seminar, as is only natural. But no one forces him to take such courses. For semesters or for years he may, if he pleases, merely make use of the libraries and listen to lectures. Students who take a long while before deciding upon a single field of knowledge thereby delay their admission into the order, but the authorities show great patience in allowing and even encouraging their explorations of all possible disciplines and types of study. Aside from good moral conduct, nothing is required of them except the composition of a life every year. It is to this old and much mocked custom that we owe the 3 lives by Knecht written during his years of free study. These were, then, not a purely voluntary and unofficial, not to say secret and more or less illicit kind of literary activity, such as his poems written at Waldsall had been, but a normal and official assignment. Far back in the earliest days of the pedagogic province the custom had arisen of requiring the younger students, those who had not yet been admitted to the order, to compose from time to time a special kind of essay or stylistic exercise which was called a life. It was to be a fictitious autobiography set in any period of the past the writer chose. The student's assignment was to transpose himself back to the surroundings, culture, and intellectual climate of any earlier era and to imagine himself living a suitable life in that period. Depending on the times and the fashion, imperial Rome, 17th century France, or 15th century Italy might be the period most favored, or Periclean Athens or Austria in the time of Mozart. Among language specialists it had become the custom to compose their imaginary biographies in the language of the country and the style of the period in which they were versed. Thus, there had been highly ingenious lives written in the style of the papal curia at Rome around the year 1200, in monastic Latin, in the Italian of the Cento Novelle Antiche, in the French of Montaigne, and the Baroque German of Martin Opitz. A remnant of the ancient Asian doctrine of reincarnation and the transmigration of souls survived in this playful, highly flexible form. All teachers and students were familiar with the concept that their present existence might have been preceded by others, in other bodies, at other times, under other conditions. To be sure, they did not believe this in any strict sense. There was no element of dogma in the idea. Rather, it was an exercise, a game for the imaginative faculties, to conceive of oneself in different conditions and surroundings. In writing such lives, students made a stab at a cautious penetration of past cultures, times, and countries, just as they did in many seminars on stylistics, and in the glass bead game as well. They learned to regard their own persons as masks, as the transitory garb of an entelechy. The custom of writing such lives had its charm, and a good many solid benefits as well, or it probably would not have endured for so long. Incidentally, there was a rather considerable number of students who not only more or less believed in the idea of reincarnation, but also in the truth of their own fictional lives. Thus, the majority of these imaginary pre-existences were not merely stylistic exercises in historical studies, but also creations of wishful thinking and exalted self-portraits. The authors cast themselves as the characters they longed to become. They portrayed their dream and their ideal. Furthermore, from the pedagogic point of view, the lives were not a bad idea at all. They provided a legitimate channel for the creative urge of youth. Although serious, creative literary work had been frowned on for generations, and replaced partly by scholarship, partly by the glass bead game, youth's artistic impulse had not been crushed. In these lives, which were often elaborated into small novels, it found a permissible means of expression. What is more, while writing these lives, some of the authors took their first steps into the land of self-knowledge. Incidentally, the students frequently used their lives for critical and revolutionary outbursts on the contemporary world and on Castalia. The teachers usually regarded such sallies with understanding benevolence. In addition, these lives were extremely revealing to the teachers during those periods in which the students enjoyed maximum freedom and were subject to no close supervision. The compositions often provided astonishingly clear insight into the intellectual and moral state of the authors. 3 such lives written by Joseph Knecht have been preserved. We intend to reproduce their full text, and regard them as possibly the most valuable part of our book. There is much room for conjecture as to whether he wrote only these 3 lives, or whether there might have been others which have been lost. All we know definitely is that after Knecht handed in his 3rd, Indian, life, the Secretariat of the Board of Educators suggested that if he wrote any additional lives, he ought to set them in an era historically closer to the present and more richly documented, and that he should pay more attention to historical detail. We know from anecdotes and letters that he thereupon actually engaged in preliminary research for a life set in the 18th century. He cast himself as a Swabian pastor who subsequently turned from the service of the church to music, who had been a disciple of Johann Albrecht Bengel, a friend of Oettinger, and for a while a guest of Zinzendorf's congregation of Moravian Brethren. We know that he was reading and taking notes on a quantity of old and often out-of-the-way books on church organization, Pietism, and Zinzendorf, as well as on the liturgy and church music of the period. We know also that he was fascinated with Oettinger, the charismatic prelate, and that he felt genuine love and veneration for Magister Bengel. He went to some pains to have a photograph made of Bengel's portrait and for a while had the picture standing on his desk. He also honestly tried to write an account of Zinzendorf, who both intrigued and repelled him. But in the end he dropped this project, content with what he had learned from it. He declared that he had lost the capacity for making a life out of these materials through having studied the subject from too many angles and accumulated too many details. In view of this statement, we may justifiably regard the 3 lives he did complete rather as the creations of a poetic spirit than the works of a scholar. In saying this, we do not think we are doing them any injustice. In addition to the freedom of the student at last permitted to range at will in self-chosen studies, Knecht now enjoyed a different kind of freedom and relaxation. He had not, after all, been merely a student like all the others. He had not only submitted to the strict training, the exacting schedules, the careful supervision and scrutiny of the teachers, in a word, to all the rigor of elite schooling. For along with all that, because of his relationship to Plinio, he had borne the far greater strain of a responsibility which had in part spurred him to the utmost of his potentialities, in part drawn heavily on his energies. In assuming the role of public advocate of Castalia, he had taken on a responsibility that was really too much for his years and his strength. He had run grave risks, and succeeded only by applying excessive willpower and talent. In fact, without the music master's powerful assistance from afar, he would not have been able to carry his assignment to its conclusion. At the end of those unusual years at Waldsall we find him, a young man of 24, mature beyond his age and somewhat overstrained, but amazingly bearing no visible traces of damage. But the degree to which his whole nature had been taxed and brought to the verge of exhaustion is apparent, although there is no direct documentation for it, from the way he employed the first few years of that freedom he had at last attained, and for which he had no doubt deeply yearned. Having stood in so conspicuous a position during his last years at school, he immediately and completely withdrew from the public eye. Indeed, when we seek the traces of his life at that time, we have the impression that if he could he would have made himself invisible. No surroundings and no society seemed undemanding enough for him, no mode of living private enough. For example, he replied curtly and reluctantly to several long and tempestuous letters from Designori, then ceased to answer altogether. The famous student Knecht vanished and could no longer be located, but in Waldsall his fame continued to flower, and in time became almost a legend. At the beginning of his years of free study he avoided Waldsall for the reasons given. This meant that for the time being he eschewed the graduate and postgraduate courses in the glass bead game. But although to the superficial observer Knecht was ostentatiously neglecting the game, we know that on the contrary the entire seemingly wayward and disconnected, and certainly altogether unusual course of his studies had been influenced by the glass bead game and led back to it and to the service of the game. We mean to discuss this somewhat at length, for this trait was characteristic. Joseph Knecht employed his freedom for study in the strangest and most idiosyncratic fashion, one that revealed an astonishing youthful genius. During his years at Waldsall he had, as was usual, taken the official introduction to the glass bead game and the review course as well. During his last school year and among his friends he already had the reputation of being an excellent player. But then he was gripped with such a passion for this game of games that after completing another course and while still in school he had been admitted to a course for players of the second stage, which was a very rare distinction indeed. Some years later he told his friend and later assistant, Fritz Tegularius, who had at school taken the review course along with him, of an experience which not only decided his destiny as a glass bead game player, but also greatly influenced the course of his studies. The letter is extant. The passage runs, "Let me remind you of the time the two of us, assigned to the same group, were so eagerly working on our first sketches for glass bead games. Do you recall a certain day and a certain game? Our group leader had given us various suggestions and proposed all sorts of themes for us to choose from. We had just arrived at the delicate transition from astronomy, mathematics, and physics to the sciences of language and history, and the leader was a virtuoso in the art of setting traps for eager beginners like us and luring us onto the thin ice of impermissible abstractions and analogies. He would slip into our hands tempting baubles taken from etymology and comparative linguistics, and enjoyed seeing us grab them and come to grief. We counted Greek quantities until we were worn out, only to feel the rug pulled out from under us when he suddenly confronted us with the possibility, in fact the necessity, of accentual instead of a quantitative scansion, and so on. In formal terms he did his job brilliantly and quite properly, although I did not like the spirit of it. He showed us false trails and lured us into faulty conjectures, partly with the good intention of familiarizing us with the perils, but also a little in order to laugh at us for being such stupid boys and to instill a heavy dose of skepticism into those of us who were most enthusiastic about the game. And yet as things turned out it happened under his instruction and in the course of one of his complicated trick experiments. We were timidly and awkwardly trying to sketch a halfway decent game problem, that I was all at once seized by the meaning and the greatness of our game, and was shaken by it to the core of my being. We were picking apart a problem in linguistic history and, as it were, examining close up the peak period of glory in the history of a language. In minutes we had traced the path which had taken it several centuries. And I was powerfully gripped by the vision of transitoriness. The way before our eyes such a complex, ancient, venerable organism, slowly built up over many generations, reaches its highest point, which already contains the germ of decay, and the whole intelligently articulated structure begins to droop, to degenerate, to totter toward its doom. And at the same time the thought abruptly shot through me, with a joyful, startled amazement, that despite the decay and death of that language it had not been lost, that its youth, maturity, and downfall were preserved in our memory, in our knowledge of it and its history, and would survive and could at any time be reconstructed in the symbols and formulas of scholarship as well as in the recondite formulations of the glass bead game. I suddenly realized that in the language, or at any rate in the spirit of the glass bead game, everything actually was all meaningful, that every symbol and combination of symbols led not hither and yon, not to single examples, experiments, and proofs, but into the center, the mystery and innermost heart of the world, into primal knowledge. Every transition from major to minor in a sonata, every transformation of a myth or a religious cult, every classical or artistic formulation was, I realized in that flashing moment, if seen with a truly meditative mind, nothing but a direct route into the interior of the cosmic mystery, where in the alternation between inhaling and exhaling, between heaven and earth, between yin and yang, holiness is forever being created. Of course by that time I had attended many a well-constructed and well-executed game. Listening, I had often been exalted and overjoyed by the insights such games afforded, but up to that time I had repeatedly been inclined to doubt the real value and importance of the game. After all, every neatly solved problem in mathematics could provide intellectual pleasure, every good piece of music could exalt and expand the soul toward universality when heard, and even more when played, and every reverent meditation could soothe the heart and tune it to harmony with the universe. But perhaps for that very reason, my doubts whispered, the glass bead game was merely a formal art, a clever skill, a witty combination, so that it would be better not to play this game, but to occupy oneself with uncontaminated mathematics and good music. But now for the first time I had heard the inner voice of the game itself, its meaning. It had reached me and penetrated me, and since that moment I have believed that our royal game is truly a lingua sacra, a sacred and divine language. You will remember, for you remarked on it yourself at the time, that a change had taken place within me, a summons had come to me. I can compare it only to that unforgettable call which once lifted my heart and transformed my life when as a boy I was tested by the Magister Musicae and summoned to Castalia. You noticed it. I felt that at the time, although you said not a word about it. Let us say no more about it today. But now I have something to ask you, and in order to explain my request I must tell you something that no one else knows or is to know. That my seemingly disorganized studies at the present time are not the result of whim, but of a definite underlying plan. You will recall, at least in general outline, the glass bead game exercise we constructed at that time, as pupils in the third course, and with the leader's assistance, in the course of which I heard that voice and experienced my vocation as a looser. That game began with a rhythmic analysis of a fugal theme, and in the center of it was a sentence attributed to Confucius. Now I am studying that entire game from beginning to end. That is, I am working through each of its phrases, translating it from the language of the game back into its original language, into mathematics, ornament, Chinese, Greek, and so on. At least this once in my life I intend to restudy and reconstruct systematically the entire content of a glass bead game. I have already finished the first part, and it has taken me 2 years. Of course it is going to cost me quite a few years more. But since we are granted our famous freedom of study in Castalia, this is how I mean to use it. I am familiar with the objections to such a procedure. Most of our teachers would say, we have devoted several centuries to inventing and elaborating the glass bead game as a universal language and method for expressing all intellectual concepts and all artistic values and reducing them to a common denominator. Now you come along and want to check over everything to see if it is correct. That will take you a lifetime, and you will regret it. Well, I shall not take a lifetime, and I hope I won't regret it. And now for my request. Since at present you are working in the game archives and I for special reasons prefer to keep away from Waldsall for a good while longer, I hope you will answer quite a barrage of questions for me every so often. That is, I shall be asking you to send me from the archives the unabbreviated forms of the official clefs and symbols for all sorts of themes. I am counting on you, and counting on your asking reciprocal favors as soon as there is anything I can do for you. Perhaps this is the place to cite that other passage from Connect's letters which also deals with the glass bead game, although the letter in question, addressed to the music master, was written at least a year or two later. I imagine, Knecht wrote to his patron, that one can be an excellent glass bead game player, even a virtuoso, and perhaps even a thoroughly competent Magister Ludi, without having any inkling of the real mystery of the game and its ultimate meaning. It might even be that one who does guess or know the truth might prove a greater danger to the game, were he to become a specialist in the game, or a game leader. For the dark interior, the esoterics of the game, points down into the one and all, into those depths where the eternal admin eternally breathes in and out, sufficient unto itself. One who had experienced the ultimate meaning of the game within himself would by that fact no longer be a player, he would no longer dwell in the world of multiplicity and would no longer be able to delight in invention, construction, and combination, since he would know altogether different joys and raptures. Because I think I have come close to the meaning of the glass bead game, it will be better for me and for others if I do not make the game my profession, but instead shift to music. The music master, who usually confined his correspondence to a minimum, was evidently troubled by these remarks and replied with a rather lengthy piece of friendly admonition. It is good that you yourself do not require a master of the game to be an esoteric, in your sense of the word, for I hope you wrote that without irony. A game master or teacher who was primarily concerned with being close enough to the innermost meaning would be a very bad teacher. To be candid, I myself, for example, have never in my life said a word to my pupils about the meaning of music. If there is one, it does not need my explanations. On the other, I have always made a great point of having my pupils count their eighths and sixteenths nicely. Whatever you become, teacher, scholar, or musician, have respect for the meaning, but do not imagine that it can be taught. Once upon a time the philosophers of history ruined half of world history with their efforts to teach such meaning. They inaugurated the age of the feuilleton and are partly to blame for quantities of spilled blood. If I were introducing pupils to Homer or Greek tragedy, say, I would also not try to tell them that the poetry is one of the manifestations of the divine, but would endeavor to make the poetry accessible to them by imparting a precise knowledge of its linguistic and metrical strategies. The task of the teacher and scholar is to study means, cultivate tradition, and preserve the purity of methods, not to deal in incommunicable experiences which are reserved to the elect, who often enough pay a high price for this privilege. There is no other mention of the glass bead game and its esoteric aspect in all the rest of Connect's correspondence of that period. Indeed, he does not seem to have written many letters, or else some of them have been lost. At any rate, the largest and best preserved correspondence, that with Ferromonte, deals almost entirely with problems of music and musical stylistic analysis. Thus there was a special meaning and resolution behind the peculiar zigzag course of Connect's studies, which consisted in nothing less than the circumstantial retracing and prolonged analysis of a single game pattern. In order to assimilate the contents of this one pattern, which the schoolboys had composed as an exercise within a few days, and which could be read off in a quarter hour in the language of the glass bead game, he spent year after year sitting in lecture halls and libraries, studying Froberger and Alessandro Scarlatti, fugues and sonata form, reviewing mathematics, learning Chinese, working through a system of tonal figuration and the Feuchtelian theory of the correspondence between the scale of colors and the musical keys. We may ask why he had chosen this toilsome, eccentric, and above all lonely path, for his ultimate goal, outside of Castalia, people would say. His choice of profession was undoubtedly the glass bead game. He might freely have entered one of the institutes of the Vicus Lusorum, the settlement of glass bead game players in Waldsall, as a guest scholar. In that case, all the special studies connected with the game would have been made easier for him. Advice and information on all questions of detail would have been available to him at any time, and in addition he could have pursued his studies among other scholars in the same field, young men with the same devotion to the game, instead of struggling alone in a state that often amounted to voluntary banishment. Be that as it may, he went his own way. We suspect that he avoided Waldsall partly to expunge as far as possible from his own mind and the minds of others the memory of his role as a student there, partly so that he would not stumble into a similar role among the community of glass bead game players. For he probably bore away the feeling from those early days that he was predestined to become a leader and spokesman, and he did all that he could to outwit the obtrusiveness of fate. He sensed in advance the weight of responsibility. He could already feel it toward his fellow students from Waldsall, who went on adulating him even though he withdrew from them. And he felt it especially toward Tegularius, who would go through fire and water for him. This he knew instinctively. Therefore he sought seclusion and contemplation, while his destiny tried to propel him forward into the public realm. It is in these terms that we imagine his state of mind at the time. But there was another important factor that deterred him from taking the usual courses at the higher glass bead game academies and made an outsider of him. That was an inexorable urge toward research arising from his former doubts about the glass bead game. To be sure, he had once tasted the experience that the game could be played in a supreme and sacred sense, but he had also seen that the majority of players and students of the game, and even some of the leaders and teachers, by no means shared that lofty and sacramental feeling for the game. They did not regard the game language as a lingua sacra, but more as an ingenious kind of stenography. They practiced the game as an interesting or amusing specialty, an intellectual sport or an arena for ambition. In fact, as his letter to the music master shows, he already sensed that the search for ultimate meaning does not necessarily determine the quality of the player, that its superficial aspects were also essential to the game, that it comprised technique, science, and social institution. In short, he had doubts and divided feelings. The game was a vital question for him, had become the chief problem of his life, and he was by no means disposed to let well-meaning spiritual guides ease his struggles or benignly smiling teachers dismiss them as trivial. Naturally, he could have made any one of the tens of thousands of recorded glass bead games and the millions of possible games the basis of his studies. He knew this and therefore proceeded from that chance game plan that he and his schoolmates had composed in an elementary course. It was the game in which he had for the first time grasped the meaning of all glass bead games and experienced his vocation as a player. During those years he kept with him at all times an outline of that game, noted down in the usual shorthand. In the symbols, ciphers, signatures, and abbreviations of the game language and astronomical formula, the principles of form underlying an old sonata, an utterance of Confucius, and so on, were written down. A reader who chanced to be ignorant of the glass bead game might imagine such a game pattern as rather similar to the pattern of a chess game, except that the significances of the pieces and the potentialities of their relationships to one another and their effect upon one another multiplied manyfold, and an actual content must be ascribed to each piece, each constellation, each chess move, of which this move, configuration, and so on is the symbol. Connect's studies went beyond the task of acquainting himself in the utmost detail with the contents, principles, books, and systems contained in the game plan, and retracting as he went away back through various cultures, sciences, languages, arts, and centuries. He had also set himself the task that none of his teachers even recognized, of employing these objects to check in detail the systems and possibilities of expression in the art of the glass bead game. To anticipate his results, here and there he found a gap, an inadequacy, but on the whole our glass bead game withstood his stringent reassessment. Otherwise he would not have returned to it at the end of his work. If we were writing a study in cultural history, a good many of the places and scenes of Connect's student days would certainly merit description. As far as possible he preferred places where he could work alone, or with only a very few others, and to some of these places he retained a lifelong grateful attachment. He frequently stayed in Monteport, sometimes as the music master's guest, sometimes as a participant in a musicological seminar. Twice we find him in Hersland, the headquarters of the order, as a participant in the great exercise, the 12-day period of fasting and meditation. He used later to tell his intimates with special affection about the bamboo grove, the lovely hermitage which was the scene of his I Ching studies. There he learned and experienced things of crucial importance. There, too, guided by a wonderful premonition or providence, he found unique surroundings and an extraordinary person, the founder and inmate of the Chinese hermitage, who was called Elder Brother. We think it proper to describe at greater length this most remarkable episode in his years of free study. Knecht had begun his studies of the Chinese language and classics in the famous Far Eastern College which for generations had been affiliated to St. Urban's, the academic complex devoted to classical philology. There he had made rapid progress in reading and writing and also struck up friendships with several of the Chinese working there, and had learned a number of the odes of the Shi Qing by heart. In the second year of his stay he turned to a more and more intense study of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. The Chinese provided him with all sorts of information, but no introductory course. There was no teacher available in the college, and after Necht had repeatedly petitioned them for an instructor for a thorough study of the I Ching, he was told about elder brother and his hermitage. It had become apparent to Necht that his interest in the Book of Changes was leading him into a field which the teachers of the college preferred to keep at a distance, and he therefore grew more cautious in his inquiries. Now, as he made efforts to obtain further information about this legendary elder brother, it became obvious to him that the hermit enjoyed a measure of respect, and indeed a degree of fame, but more as an eccentric loner than as a scholar. Necht sensed that he would have to help himself. He finished a paper he had begun for a seminar as quickly as possible, and took his leave. On foot, he made his way to the region in which the mysterious man, perhaps a sage and master, perhaps a fool, had long ago established his bamboo grove. He had gathered a few bits of information about the hermit. Some 25 years before, the man had been the most promising student in the Chinese department. He seemed to have been born for these studies, outdid his best teachers, both Chinese by birth and Westerners, in the technique of brush writing and the deciphering of ancient texts, but became somewhat notorious for the zeal with which he also tried to make himself into a Chinese in outward matters also. Thus he obstinately refused to address his superiors, from the instructor of a seminar to the masters, by their titles, as all other students did. Instead, he called them, my elder brother, until at last this appellation became attached to himself as a nickname. He devoted special attention to the oracular game of the I Ching, and developed a masterly skill at practicing it with the traditional yarrow stocks. Along with the ancient commentaries on the Book of Changes, his favorite book was the philosophical work of Chuang Tzu. Evidently the rationalistic, somewhat anti-mystical, and declaredly Confucian spirit of the Chinese department of the college, as Necht encountered it, had already been prevalent at that time, for one day elder brother left the institute, which would gladly have kept him as a teacher, and set out on a walking tour, armed with brush, Chinese ink saucer, and 2 or 3 books. He made his way to the southern part of the country, turning up here and there to visit for a while with brethren of the order. He looked for and finally found the suitable spot for the hermitage he planned, stubbornly bombarded both the secular authorities and the order with written and oral petitions until they granted him the right to settle there and cultivate the area. Ever since, he had been living in an idyllic retreat strictly governed by ancient Chinese principles. Some referred to him with amusement as a crank, others venerated him as a kind of saint. But apparently he was content with himself and at peace with the world, devoting his days to meditation and the copying of ancient scrolls whenever he was not occupied with his bamboo grove, which sheltered from the north wind a carefully laid out Chinese miniature garden. Joseph Necht, then, tramped toward this hermitage, making frequent stops to rest, delighting in the landscape that lay smiling beneath him as soon as he had climbed through the mountain passes, stretching southward in a blue haze, with sunlit terraced vineyards, brown stone walls alive with lizards, stately chestnut groves, a piquant mingling of southland and high mountain country. It was late afternoon when he reached the bamboo grove. He entered and looked with astonishment upon a Chinese pavilion set in the midst of a curious garden, with a splashing fountain fed by a wooden pipe. The overflow ran along a gravel bed into a masonry basin, in whose crevices all sorts of green plants flourished. A few goldfish swam around in the still, crystalline water. Fragile and peaceful, the feathery crowns of the bamboos swayed on their strong, slender shafts. The sward was punctuated by stone slabs carved with inscriptions in the classical style. A frail man dressed in tan linen, glasses over blue eyes that bore a tentative look, straightened up from a flower bed over which he had been bending and slowly approached the visitor. His manner was not unfriendly, but it had that somewhat awkward shyness rather common among solitaries and recluses. He looked inquiringly at Necht and waited for what he had to say. With some embarrassment Necht spoke the Chinese words he had already formulated. The young disciple takes the liberty of paying his respects to elder brother. The well-bred guest is welcome, elder brother said. May a young colleague always be welcome to a bowl of tea and a little agreeable conversation, and a bed for the night may be found for him, if this is desired. Necht kowtowed, expressed his thanks, and was led into the pavilion and served tea. Then he was shown the garden, the carved slabs, the pond, the goldfish, and was even told the age of the fish. Until supper time they sat under the swaying bamboos exchanging courtesies, verses from odes, and sayings from the classical writers. They looked at the flowers and took pleasure in the fading pinks of sunset along the mountain ranges. Then they re-entered the house. Elder brother served bread and fruit, cooked an excellent pancake for each of them on a tiny stove, and after they had eaten he asked in German the purpose of his visit, and in German Necht explained why he had come and what he desired, which was to stay as long as elder brother permitted him, and to become his disciple. We shall discuss that tomorrow, the hermit said, and showed his guest to a bed. Next morning Necht sat down by the goldfish pool and gazed into the cool small world of darkness and light and magically shimmering colors, where the bodies of the golden fish glided in the dark greenish blueness and inky blackness. Now and then, just when the entire world seemed enchanted, asleep forever in a dreamy spell, the fish would dart with a supple and yet alarming movement, like flashes of crystal and gold, through the somnolent darkness. He looked down, becoming more and more absorbed, daydreaming rather than meditating, and was not conscious when elder brother stepped softly out of the house, paused, and stood for a long time watching his bemused guest. When Necht at last shook off his abstraction and stood up, he was no longer there, but his voice soon called from inside an invitation to tea. They greeted each other briefly, drank tea, and sat listening in the matutinal stillness to the sound of the small jet of water from the fountain, a melody of eternity. Then the hermit stood up, busied himself here and there about the irregularly shaped room, now and then glancing, blinking rapidly, at Necht. Suddenly he asked, "Are you ready to don your shoes and continue your journeying?" Necht hesitated. Then he said, "If it must be so, I am ready. And if it should chance that you stay here a little while, are you ready to be obedient and to keep as still as a goldfish?" Again Necht said he was ready. "It is well," elder brother said. "Now I shall lay the stocks and consult the oracle." While Necht sat and looked on with an awe equal to his curiosity, keeping as still as a goldfish, elder brother fetched from a wooden beaker, which was rather a kind of quiver, a handful of sticks. These were the yarrow stocks. He counted them out carefully, returned one part of the bundle to the vessel, laid a stock aside, divided the rest into 2 equal bundles, kept one in his left hand, and with the sensitive fingertips of his right hand took tiny little clusters from the pack in his left. He counted these and laid them aside until only a few stalks remained. These he held between 2 fingers of his left hand. After thus reducing one bundle by ritual counting to a few stalks, he followed the same procedure with the other bundle. He laid the counted stalks to one side, then went through both bundles again, one after the other, counting, clamping small remnants of bundles between 2 fingers. His fingers performed all this with economical motions and quiet agility. It looked like an occult game of skill governed by strict rules, practiced thousands of times and brought to a high degree of virtuoso dexterity. After he had gone through the same process several times, 3 small bundles remained. From the number of stalks in them he read an ideograph which he drew with a tapering brush on a small piece of paper. Now the whole complicated procedure began anew. The sticks were divided again into 2 equal bundles, counted, laid aside, thrust between fingers, until in the end again 3 tiny bundles remained which resulted in a second ideograph. Moved about like dancers, making very soft, dry clicks, the stalks came together, changed places, formed bundles, were separated, were counted anew. They shifted positions rhythmically, with a ghostly sureness. At the end of each process an ideograph was written, until finally the positive and negative symbols stood in 6 lines one above the other. The stalks were gathered up and carefully replaced in their container. The sage sat cross-legged on the floor of reed matting, for a long time silently examining the result of the augury on the sheet of paper. "It is the sign Mong," he said. "This sign bears the name, Youthful Folly. Above the mountain, below the water, above Jen, below Khan. At the foot of the fountain the spring bubbles forth, the symbol of youth. The verdict reads, Youthful Folly wins success. I do not seek the young fool. The young fool seeks me. At the first oracle I give knowledge. If he asks again, it is importunity. If he importunes, I give no knowledge. Perseverance is beneficial." Necht had been holding his breath from sheer suspense. In the ensuing silence he involuntarily gave a deep sigh of relief. He did not dare to ask. But he thought he had understood. The young fool had turned up, he would be permitted to stay. Even while he was still enthralled by the sublime marionette's dance of fingers and sticks, which he had watched for so long and which looked so persuasively meaningful, the result took hold of him. The oracle had spoken, it had decided in his favor. We would not have described this episode in such detail if Necht himself had not so frequently related it to his friends with a certain relish. Now we shall return to our scholarly account. Necht remained at the bamboo grove for months and learned to manipulate the yarrow stalks almost as well as his teacher. The latter spent an hour a day with him, practicing counting the sticks, imparting the grammar and symbolism of the oracular language, and drilling him in writing and memorizing the 64 signs. He read to Necht from ancient commentaries, and every so often, on particularly good days, told him a story by Chuang Tzu. For the rest, the disciple learned to tend the garden, wash the brushes, and prepare the Chinese ink. He also learned to make soup and tea, gather brushwood, observe the weather, and handle the Chinese calendar. But his rare attempts to introduce the glass bead game and music into their sparing conversations yielded no results whatsoever. They seemed to fall upon deaf ears, or else were turned aside with a forbearing smile or a proverb such as, dense clouds, no rain, or, nobility is without flaw. But when Necht had a small clavichord sent from Monteport and spent an hour a day playing, elder brother made no objection. Once Necht confessed to his teacher that he wished to learn enough to be able to incorporate the system of the I Ching into the glass bead game. Elder brother laughed. "Go ahead and try," he exclaimed. "You'll see how it turns out. Anyone can create a pretty little bamboo garden in the world. But I doubt that the gardener would succeed in incorporating the world in his bamboo grove. But enough of this. We shall mention only the one further fact that some years later, when Necht was already a highly respected personage in Waldsall and invited elder brother to give a course there, he received no answer. Afterward Joseph Necht described the months he lived in the bamboo grove as an unusually happy time. He also frequently referred to it as the beginning of my awakening, and in fact from that period on the image of awakening turns up more and more often in his remarks, with a meaning similar to although not quite the same as that he had formerly attributed to the image of vocation. It could be assumed that the awakening signified knowledge of himself and of the place he occupied within the Castalian and the general human order of things. But it seems to us that the accent increasingly shifts towards self-knowledge in the sense that from the beginning of his awakening, Knecht came closer and closer to a sense of his special, unique position and destiny, while at the same time, the concepts and categories of the traditional hierarchy of the world and of the special Castalian hierarchy became for him more and more relative matters. His Chinese studies were far from concluded during his stay in the bamboo grove. They continued, and Knecht made particular efforts to acquire a knowledge of ancient Chinese music. Everywhere in the older Chinese writers he encountered praise of music as one of the primal sources of all order, morality, beauty, and health. This broad, ethical view of music was familiar to him from of old, for the music master could be regarded as the very embodiment of it. Without ever forsaking the fundamental plan of his studies, which as we have seen he outlined in his letter to Fritz Tegularius, he pushed forward energetically on a broad front wherever he scented an element of essential value to himself, that is to say, wherever the path of awakening, on which he had already set out, seemed to lead him. One of the positive results of his period of apprenticeship with elder brother was that he overcame his resistance against returning to Waldsall. Henceforth he participated in one of the advanced courses there every year, and without quite realizing how it had happened he became a personage regarded with interest and esteem in the Vicus Lusorum. He belonged to that central and most sensitive organ of the entire game organization, that anonymous group of players of proven worth in whose hands lay the destinies of the game at any given time, or at least the type of play that happened to be in fashion. Officials of the game institutes belonged to but did not dominate this group, which usually met in several remote, quiet rooms of the game archives. There the members beguiled their time with critical studies of the game, championing the inclusion of new subject areas, or arguing for their exclusion, debating for or against certain constantly shifting tastes in regard to the form, the procedures, the sporting aspects of the glass bead game. Everyone who had made a place for himself in this group was a virtuoso of the game. Each knew to a hair the talents and peculiarities of all the others. The atmosphere was like that in the corridors of a government ministry or an aristocratic club where the rulers and those who will take over their responsibilities in the near future meet and get to know one another. A muted, polished tone prevailed in this group. Its members were ambitious without showing it, keen-eyed and critical to excess. Many in Castalia, and some in the rest of the country outside the province, regarded this elite as the ultimate flower of Castalian tradition, the cream of an exclusive intellectual aristocracy, and a good many youths dreamed for years of someday belonging to it themselves. To others, however, this select circle of candidates for the higher reaches in the hierarchy of the glass bead game seemed odious and debased, a clique of haughty idlers, brilliant but spoiled geniuses who lacked all feeling for life and reality, an arrogant and fundamentally parasitic company of dandies and climbers who had made a silly game, a sterile self-indulgence of the mind, their vocation and the content of their life. Knecht was untouched by either of these attitudes. It did not matter to him whether he figured in student gossip as some sort of phenomenon or as a parvenu and climber. What was important to him were his studies, all of which now centered around the game. Another preoccupation was, perhaps, that one question of whether the game really was the supreme achievement of Castalia and worth devoting one's life to. For even as he was familiarizing himself with the ever more recondite mysteries of the game's laws and potentialities, even as he became more and more at home in the labyrinths of the archives and the complex inner world of the game's symbolism, his doubts had by no means been silenced. He had already learned by experience that faith and doubt belong together, that they govern each other like inhaling and exhaling, and that his very advances in all aspects of the game's miracosm naturally sharpened his eyes to all the dubiousness of the game. For a little while, perhaps, the idol in the bamboo grove had reassured him, or perhaps one might say confused him. The example of elder brother had shown him that there were ways of escaping from this dubiousness. It was possible, for example, as that recluse had done, to turn oneself into a Chinese, shut oneself off behind a garden hedge, and live in a self-sufficient and beautiful kind of perfection. One might also become a Pythagorean or a monk and scholastic, but these were still escapes, renunciations of universality possible and permissible only to a few. They involved renunciation of the present and the future in favor of something perfect enough, but past. Knecht had sensed in good time that this type of escape was not the way for him. But what then was the way for him? Aside from his great talent for music and for the glass bead game, he was aware of still other forces within himself, a certain inner independence, a self-reliance which by no means barred him or hampered him from serving, but demanded of him that he serve only the highest master. And this strength, this independence, this self-reliance, was not just a trait in his character, it was not just interned and effective only upon himself, it also affected the outside world. As early as his years at school, and especially during the period of his contest with Plinio Designori, Joseph Knecht had often noticed that many schoolmates his own age, but even more the younger boys, liked him, sought his friendship, and moreover tended to let him dominate them. They asked him for advice, put themselves under his influence. Ever since, this experience had been repeated frequently. It had its pleasant and flattering side. It satisfied ambition and strengthened self-confidence. But it also had another, a dark and terrifying side. For there was something bad and unpalatable about the attitude one took toward these schoolmates so eager for advice, guidance, and an example, about the impulse to despise them for their lack of self-reliance and dignity, and about the occasional secret temptation to make them, at least in thought, into obedient slaves. Moreover, during the time with Plinio he had had a taste of the responsibility, strain, and psychological burden which is the price paid for every brilliant and publicly representative position. He knew also that the music master sometimes felt weighed down by his own position. It was lovely and tempting to exert power over men and to shine before others, but power also had its perditions and perils. History, after all, consisted of an unbroken succession of rulers, leaders, bosses, and commanders who, with extremely rare exceptions, had all begun well and ended badly. All of them, at least so they said, had striven for power for the sake of the good. Afterward they had become obsessed and numbed by power and loved it for its own sake. What he must do was to sanctify and make wholesome the power nature had bestowed on him by placing it in the service of the hierarchy. This was something he had always taken for granted. But where was his rightful place? Where would his energies be put to best use and bear fruit? The capacity to attract and more or less to influence others, especially those younger than himself, would of course have been useful to an army officer or a politician. But in Castalia there was no place for such occupations. Here these qualities were useful only to the teacher and educator, but Knecht felt hardly drawn to such work. If it had been a question of his own desires alone, he would have preferred the life of the independent scholar to all others, or else that of a glass bead game player. And in reaching this conclusion he once more faced the old, tormenting question. Was this game really the highest, really the sovereign in the realm of the intellect? Was it not, in spite of everything and everyone, in the end merely a game after all? Did it really merit full devotion, lifelong service? Generations ago this famous game had begun as a kind of substitute for art, and for many it was gradually developing into a kind of religion, allowing highly trained intellects to indulge in contemplation, edification, and devotional exercises. Obviously, the old conflict between aesthetics and ethics was going on in Knecht. The question never fully expressed but likewise never entirely suppressed, was the very one that had now and then erupted, dark and threatening, from beneath the surface of the schoolboy poems he had written in Waldsall. That question was addressed not just to the glass bead game, but to Castalia as a whole. There was a period when this whole complex of problems troubled him so deeply that he was always dreaming of debates with Designori. And one day, as he was strolling across one of the spacious courtyards of the Waldsall players' village, he heard someone behind him calling his name. The voice sounded very familiar, although he did not recognize it at once. When he turned around he saw a tall young man with a trim beard rushing tempestuously toward him. It was Plinio, and with a surge of affection and warm memories, Joseph greeted him heartily. They arranged to meet that evening. Plinio, who had long ago finished his studies at the universities in the outside world and was already a government official, had come to Waldsall on holiday for a short guest course in the glass bead game, as he had in fact done once before, several years earlier. The evening they spent together, however, proved an embarrassment to both friends. Plinio was here as a guest student, a tolerated dilettante from outside. Although he was pursuing his course with great eagerness, it was nevertheless a course for outsiders and amateurs. The distance between them was too great. He was facing a professional, an initiate whose very delicacy and polite interest in his friend's enthusiasm for the glass bead game inevitably made him feel that he was not a colleague but a child playfully dabbling on the outer edges of a science which the other understood to its very core. Knecht tried to turn the conversation away from the game by asking Plinio about his official functions and his life on the outside. And now Joseph was the laggard and the child who asked innocent questions and was tactfully tutored. Plinio had gone into law, was seeking political influence, and was about to become engaged to the daughter of a party leader. He spoke a language that Joseph only half understood. Many recurrent expressions sounded empty to him, or seemed to have no content. At any rate he realized that Plinio counted for something in his world, knew his way about in it, and had ambitious aims. But the two worlds, which 10 years ago both youths had each touched with tentative curiosity and a measure of sympathy, had by now grown irreconcilably apart. Joseph could appreciate the fact that this man of the world and politician had retained a certain attachment to Castalia. This was, after all, the second time he was sacrificing a holiday to the glass bead game. But in the end, Joseph thought, it was pretty much the same as if he were one day to pay a visit to Plinio's district and attend a few sessions of the court as a curious guest, and have Plinio show him through a few factories or welfare institutions. Both were disappointed. Knecht found his former friend coarse and superficial. Designori, for his part, found his former schoolmate distinctly haughty in his exclusive esotericism and intellectuality. He seemed to Plinio to have become a pure intellect, altogether absorbed by himself and his sport. Both made an effort, however, and Designori had all sorts of tales to tell about his studies and examinations, about journeys to England and to the South, political meetings, Parliament. At one point, moreover, he said something that sounded like a threat or a warning. "You will see," he said. "Soon there will be times of unrest, perhaps wars, in which case your whole existence in Castalia might well come under attack." Joseph did not take this too seriously. He merely asked, "And what about you, Plinio? In that case would you be for or against Castalia?" "Oh that," Plinio said with a forced smile. "It's not likely that I'd be asked my opinion. But of course I favor the undisturbed continuance of Castalia, otherwise I wouldn't be here, you know. Still and all, although your material requirements are so modest, Castalia costs the country quite a little sum every year." "Yes," Joseph said, laughing, "it amounts, I am told, to about a tenth of what our country used to spend annually for armaments during the century of wars." They met several more times, and the closer the end of Plinio's course approached, the more assiduous they became in courtesies toward each other. But it was a relief to both when the 2 or 3 weeks were over and Plinio departed. The Magister Ludi at that time was Thomas von der Trave, a famous, widely traveled, and cosmopolitan man, gracious and obliging toward everyone who approached him, but severe to the point of fanaticism in guarding the game against contamination. He was a great worker, something unsuspected by those who knew him only in his public role, dressed in his festive robes to conduct the great games, or receiving delegations from abroad. He was said to be a cool, even icy rationalist, whose relationship to the arts was one of mere distant civility. Among the young and ardent amateurs of the glass bead game, rather deprecatory opinions of him could be heard at times. Misjudgments, for if he was not an enthusiast and in the great public games tended to avoid touching on grand and exciting themes, the brilliant construction and unequaled form of his games proved to the cognoscenti his total grasp of the subtlest problems of the game's world. One day the Magister Ludi sent for Joseph Knecht. He received him in his home, in everyday clothes, and asked whether he would care to come for half an hour every day at this same time for the next few days. Knecht, who had never before had any private dealings with the master, was somewhat astonished. For the present, the master showed him a bulky memorandum, a proposal he had received from an organist, one of the innumerable proposals which the directorate of the game regularly had to examine. Usually these were suggestions for the admission of new material to the archives. One man, for example, had made a meticulous study of the history of the madrigal and discovered in the development of the style a curve that he had expressed both musically and mathematically, so that it could be included in the vocabulary of the game. Another had examined the rhythmic structure of Julius Caesar's Latin and discovered the most striking congruences with the results of well-known studies of the intervals in Byzantine hymns. Or again, some fanatic had once more unearthed some new Kabbalah hidden in the musical notation of the 15th century. Then there were the tempestuous letters from abstruse experimenters who could arrive at the most astounding conclusions from, say, a comparison of the horoscopes of Goethe and Spinoza. Such letters often included pretty and seemingly enlightening geometric drawings in several colors. Knecht attacked the manuscript with eagerness. He himself, after all, had often pondered such proposals, although he had never submitted any. Every active glass bead game player naturally dreams of a constant expansion of the fields of the game until they include the entire universe. Or rather, he constantly performs such expansions in his imagination in his private games, and cherishes the secret desire for the ones which seem to prove their viability to be crowned by official acceptance. The true and ultimate finesse in the private games of advanced players consists, of course, in their developing such mastery over the expressive, nomenclatural, and formative factors of the game that they can inject individual and original ideas into any given game played with objective historical materials. A distinguished botanist once whimsically expressed the idea in an aphorism: the glass bead game should admit of everything, even that a single plant should chat in Latin with Linnaeus. Knecht, then, helped the Magister analyze the suggestion. The half-hour passed swiftly. He came punctually the next day, and so for 2 weeks came daily for a half-hour session with the Magister Ludi. During the first few days it struck him that the master was asking him to work carefully and critically through altogether inferior memoranda, whose uselessness was evident at first glance. He wondered that the master had time for this sort of thing, and gradually became aware that the purpose was not just to lighten the master's workload. Rather, this assignment, although necessary in itself, was giving the master a chance to subject him, the young adept, to an extremely courteous but stringent examination. What was taking place was rather similar to the appearance of the music master in his boyhood. He suddenly became aware of it now by the behavior of his associates, who treated him more shyly, reservedly, and sometimes with ironic respect. Something was in the wind, he sensed it, but now it was far less a source of joy than it had been then. After the last of these sessions the Magister Ludi said in his rather high, courteous voice and in that carefully enunciated speech of his, but without the slightest solemnity: "Very well, you need not come tomorrow. Our business is completed for the moment. But I shall soon be having to trouble you again. Many thanks for your collaboration, it has been valuable to me. Incidentally, in my opinion you ought to apply for your admission to the order now. There will be no difficulties, I have already informed the heads of the order." As he rose he added, "One word more, just by the way. Probably you too sometimes incline, as most good glass bead game players do in their youth, to use our game as a kind of instrument for philosophizing. My words alone will not cure you of that, but nevertheless I shall say them. Philosophizing should be done only with legitimate tools, those of philosophy. Our game is neither philosophy nor religion, it is a discipline of its own, in character most akin to art. It is an art sui generis. One makes greater strides if one holds to that view from the first than if one reaches it only after 100 failures. The philosopher Kant, he is little known today, but he was a formidable thinker, once said that theological philosophizing was a magic lantern of chimeras. We should not make our glass bead game into that. Joseph was surprised. His excitement was so great that he almost failed to hear the last cautionary remarks. It had flashed through his mind that this meant the end of his freedom, the completion of his period of study, admission to the order, and his imminent enrollment in the ranks of the hierarchy. He expressed his thanks with a low bow, and went promptly to the secretariat of the order in Waldsall, where sure enough he found himself already inscribed on the list of new nominees to the order. Like all students at his level, he knew the rules of the order fairly well, and remembered that the ceremony of admission could be performed by every member of the order who held an official post in the higher ranks. He therefore requested that this be done by the music master, obtained a pass and a short furlough, and next day set out for Monteport, where his patron and friend was staying. He found the venerable old master ailing, but was welcomed with rejoicing. "You have come just in time," the old man said. "Soon I would no longer be empowered to receive you into the order as a younger brother. I am about to resign my office, my release has already been granted." The ceremony itself was simple. On the following day the music master invited 2 brothers of the order to be present as witnesses, as prescribed by the statutes. Previously, he had given Knecht a paragraph from the rules as the subject of a meditation exercise. It was the familiar passage: "If the high authority appoints you to an office, know this. Every step upward on the ladder of offices is not a step into freedom but into bondage. The higher the office, the tighter the bondage. The greater the power of the office, the stricter the service. The stronger the personality, the less self-will." The group then assembled in the magister's music cell, the same in which Knecht had long ago been introduced to the art of meditation. The master called upon the novice, in honor of the initiation, to play a chorale prelude by Bach. Then one of the witnesses read aloud the abbreviated version of the rules of the order, and the music master himself asked the ritual questions and received his young friend's oath. He accorded Joseph another hour. They sat in the garden and the master advised him on how to identify himself with the rules and live by them. "It is good," he said, "that at the moment I am departing you are stepping into the breach. It is as if I had a son who will stand in my stead." And when he saw Joseph's sad look he added, "Come now, don't be downcast. I'm not. I am very tired and looking forward to the leisure I mean to enjoy, and which you will share with me frequently, I hope. And next time we meet, use the familiar pronoun of address to me. I could not offer that as long as I held office." He dismissed him with that winning smile which Joseph had now known for 20 years. Knecht returned quickly to Waldsall, for he had been given only 3 days' leave. He was barely back when the Magister Ludi sent for him, greeted him affably as one colleague to another, and congratulated him on his admission to the order. "All that is now lacking to make us completely colleagues and associates," he continued, "is your assignment to a definite place in our organization." Joseph was somewhat taken aback. So this would be the end of his freedom. "Oh," he said timidly, "I hope I can prove useful in some modest spot somewhere. But to be candid with you, I had been hoping I would be able to continue studying freely for a while longer." The Magister looked straight into his eyes with a faintly ironic smile. "You say, a while, but how long is that?" Knecht gave an embarrassed laugh. "I really don't know. So I thought," the master said. "You are still speaking the language of students and thinking in student terms, Joseph Knecht. That is quite all right now, but soon it will no longer be all right, for we need you. Besides, you know that later on, even in the highest offices of our order, you can obtain leaves for purposes of study, if you can persuade the authorities of the value of these studies. My predecessor and teacher, for example, while he was still Magister Ludi and an old man, requested and received a full year's furlough for studies in the London archives. But he received his furlough not for a while, but for a specific number of months, weeks, and days. Henceforth you will have to count on that. And now I have a proposal to make to you. We need a reliable man who is as yet unknown outside our circle for a special mission." The assignment was the following. The Benedictine monastery of Mariaphils, one of the oldest centers of learning in the country, which maintained friendly relations with Castalia and in particular had favored the glass bead game for decades, had asked him to send a young teacher for a prolonged stay, to give introductory courses in the game and also to stimulate the few advanced players in the monastery. The Magister's choice had fallen upon Joseph Knecht. That was why he had been so discreetly tested, that was why his entry into the order had been accelerated. 4. 2 orders. In a good many respects Joseph Knecht's situation was once again similar to that in his Latin school days after the music master's visit. Joseph himself would scarcely have imagined that the appointment to Mariaphils represented a special distinction and a large first step on the ladder of the hierarchy, but he was after all a good deal wiser about such matters nowadays and could plainly read the significance of his summons in the attitude and conduct of his fellow students. Of course he had belonged for some time to the innermost circle within the elite of the glass bead game players, but now the unusual assignment marked him to all and sundry as a young man whom the superiors had their eye on and whom they intended to employ. His associates and ambitious fellow players did not exactly withdraw or become unfriendly. The members of this highly aristocratic group were far too well-mannered for that, but an aloofness nevertheless arose. Yesterday's friend might well be tomorrow's superior, and this circle registered and expressed such gradations and differentiations by the most delicate shades of behavior. One exception was Fritz Tegularius, whom we may well call, next to Ferromonte, Joseph Knecht's closest friend throughout his life. Tegularius, destined by his gifts for the highest achievements but severely hampered by certain deficiencies of health, balance, and self-confidence, was the same age as Knecht at the time of Knecht's admission to the order. That is, about 34, and had first met him some 10 years earlier in a glass bead game course. At the time Knecht had sensed how strong an attraction he exerted upon this quiet and rather melancholy youth. With that psychological instinct which he possessed even then, although without precisely knowing it, he likewise grasped the essence of this love on the part of Tegularius. It was friendship ready for unconditional devotion, a respect capable of the utmost subordination. It was imbued with an almost religious fervor, but overshadowed and held in bounds by an aristocratic reserve and a foreboding of inner tragedy. In the beginning, still shaken and oversensitive, not to say suspicious, as a result of the Designori episode, Knecht had held Tegularius at a distance by consistent sternness, although he too felt drawn to this interesting and unusual schoolfellow. For a characterization of Tegularius we may use a page from Knecht's confidential memoranda which, years later, he regularly drew up for the exclusive use of the highest authorities. It reads, Tegularius, personal friend of the writer. Recipient of several honors at school in Kupperheim. Good classical philologist, strong interest in philosophy, worked on Leibniz, Bolzano, subsequently Plato. The most brilliant and gifted glass bead game player I know. He would be predestined for Magister Ludi were it not that his character, together with his frail health, make him completely unsuited for that position. T should never be appointed to an outstanding, representative, or organizational position. That would be a misfortune for him and for the office. His deficiency takes physical form in states of low vitality, periods of insomnia and nervous aches, psychologically in spells of melancholy, a hunger for solitude, fear of duties and responsibilities, and probably also in thoughts of suicide. Dangerous though his situation is, by the aid of meditation and great self-discipline he keeps himself going so courageously that most of his acquaintances have no idea of how severely he suffers and are aware only of his great shyness and taciturnity. But although T unfortunately is not fitted for higher posts, he is nevertheless a jewel in the Vicus Lucerum, an altogether irreplaceable treasure. He has mastered the technique of our game like a great musician his instrument. He instinctively finds the most delicate nuances, and is also an exceptional instructor. In the advanced and highest review courses, for my part he would be wasted in the lower ones. I could scarcely manage without him any longer. The way he analyzes the specimen games of boys without ever discouraging them, the way he detects their tricks, infallibly recognizes and exposes everything imitative or purely decorative, the way he finds the sources of error in a game that has started well but then gone astray, and lays these errors bare like flawlessly prepared anatomical specimens, is altogether unique. It is this sharp and incorruptible talent for analysis and correction that assures him the respect of students and colleagues, which otherwise might have been jeopardized by his unstable demeanor and shyness. I should like to cite an example to illustrate T's brilliance as a glass bead game player. During the early days of my friendship with him, when both of us were already finding little more to learn by way of technique in our courses, he once, it was a moment of unusual trust, allowed me to look at several games he had composed. I saw at a glance that they were brilliantly devised and somehow novel and original in style, asked to borrow the sketches for study, and discovered that these game compositions were true literary productions, so amazing and singular that I feel I should speak of them here. These games were little dramas, in structure almost pure monologues, reflecting the imperiled but brilliant life of the author's mind like a perfect self-portrait. The various themes and groups of themes on which the games were based, and their sequences and confrontations, were brilliantly conceived, dialectically orchestrated and counterpoised. But beyond that, the synthesis and harmonization of the opposing voices was not carried to the ultimate conclusion in the usual classical manner. Rather, this harmonization underwent a whole series of refractions, of splintering into overtones, and paused each time, as if wearied and despairing, just on the point of dissolution, finally fading out in questioning and doubt. As a result, those games possessed a stirring chromatics, of a kind never before ventured, as far as I know. Moreover, the games as a whole expressed a tragic doubt and renunciation. They became figurative statements of the dubiousness of all intellectual endeavor. At the same time, in their intellectual structure as well as in their calligraphic technique and perfection, they were so extraordinarily beautiful that they brought tears to one's eyes. Each of these games moved with such gravity and sincerity toward solution, only at the last so nobly to forego the attempt at solution, that it was like a perfect elegy upon the transitoriness inherent in all beautiful things and the ultimate dubiety imminent in all soaring flights of the intellect. Item. I would recommend Tegularius, if he should outlive me or my term in office, as an extremely fine, precious, but imperiled treasure. He should be granted maximum freedom, he should be consulted on all important questions concerning the game. But students should never be placed in his sole guidance. In the course of the years this remarkable man had become Knecht's true friend. He admired Knecht's capacity for leadership as well as his mind, and showed a touching devotion toward him. In fact, much of what we know about Knecht has been handed down by Tegularius. In the innermost circle of younger glass bead game players he was perhaps the only one who did not envy his friend for the important assignment he had received, and the only one for whom Knecht's absence for an indefinite time meant an almost unbearable anguish and sense of loss. Joseph himself rejoiced in the new state of affairs as soon as he recovered from the shock of suddenly being shorn of his beloved freedom. He felt eagerness to travel, pleasure in activity, and curiosity about the alien world to which he was being sent. Incidentally, he was not allowed to depart for Mariofels without preparation. First he was assigned to the police for 3 weeks. That was the student's name for the small department within the Board of Educators which might be called its political department or even its foreign ministry, were these not somewhat grandiose names for so small an affair. There he received instruction in the rules of conduct for brothers of the order during their stays in the outside world. Dubois, The head of this office personally devoted an hour to him nearly every day. This conscientious man seemed worried that an altogether untried young man without the faintest knowledge of the world should be sent to such a foreign post. He made no attempt to conceal his disapproval of the Magister Ludi's decision, and took extra pains to inform this new member of the order on the facts of life in the outside world and the means for effectively combating its perils. His sincere paternal solicitude fortunately was matched by Joseph's willingness to be instructed. The result was that during those hours of introduction into the rules of intercourse with the world, the teacher conceived a real affection for Joseph Knecht, and finally felt able to dismiss him reassured and fully confident that the young man would be able to carry out his mission successfully. Dubois even tried, more out of personal goodwill than the demands of politics, to give Joseph a kind of additional assignment on his own behalf. As one of Castilia's few politicians, Dubois was one of that tiny group of officials whose thoughts and studies were largely devoted to sustaining the legal and economic continuance of Castilia, to regulating its relationship to the outside world and the problems that arose from its dependence on the world. The great majority of Castilians, the officials no less than the scholars and students, lived in their pedagogic province and their order as if these constituted a stable, eternal, inevitable world. They knew, of course, that it had not always existed, that it had come into being slowly and amid bitter struggles in times of cruel distress. They knew it had originated at the end of the age of wars out of a double source: the heroically ascetic efforts of scholars, artists, and thinkers who had come to their senses, and the profound craving of the exhausted, bled, and betrayed peoples for order, normality, reason, lawfulness, and moderation. Castilians knew this, and understood the function of all the orders and pedagogic provinces throughout the world: to abstain from government and competition and instead to assure stability for the spiritual foundations of moderation and law everywhere. But that the present order of things was not to be taken for granted, that it presupposed a certain harmony between the world and the guardians of culture, that this harmony could always be disrupted, and that world history taken as a whole by no means furthered what was desirable, rational, and beautiful in the life of man, but at best only occasionally tolerated it as an exception. All this they did not realize. Except for those few political thinkers like Dubois, almost all Castilians were unaware of the secret complex of problems underlying the existence of Castilia. Once Knecht won the confidence of Dubois, he was given a glimpse of the political foundations of Castilia. At first the subject struck him as rather repellent and uninteresting, which, indeed, was the reaction of most members of the order. But then he recalled Plinio Designori's remark about possible dangers to Castilia. Along with that recollection there flooded back into his mind the whole bitter aftertaste of his youthful debates with Plinio, seemingly long since settled and forgotten. Now these suddenly seemed to him of the highest importance and, moreover, a stage on the road to his awakening. At the end of their last talk Dubois said to him, "I think I can let you go now. You are to adhere strictly to the assignment His Honor the Magister Ludi has given you, and no less strictly to the rules of conduct we have taught you here. It was a pleasure to me to be able to help you. You will see that the 3 weeks we have kept you were not time lost. And if you should ever want to recompense me for my contribution to your education, I can suggest a way. You will be entering a Benedictine abbey, and if you stay there a while and commend yourself to the fathers, you will probably hear political conversations and sense political currents among the venerable fathers and their guests. If you would occasionally inform me about such matters, I would be grateful. Please understand me aright. You are certainly not to regard yourself as a kind of spy or in any way misuse confidences. You are not to pass along anything that goes against your conscience. I guarantee that we will use any information we may receive only in the interest of our order and Castilia. We are not real politicians and have no power at all, but we too are dependent on the world, which either needs or tolerates us. Circumstances may arise in which we might profit by knowing that a statesman is making a retreat in a monastery, or that the Pope is said to be ill, or that new candidates have been added to the list of future cardinals. We are not dependent on your information. We have quite a variety of sources, but one little source more can do no harm. Go now, you need not say yes or no to this matter. For the present all that is needed is for you to comport yourself well in your official assignment and do us honor among the spiritual fathers. Bon voyage." In the Book of Changes, which Knecht consulted by means of the yarrow stock ritual before he set out, he counted out the hexagram li, which signifies the wanderer, and the augury, success through smallness. Persistence is good fortune to the wanderer. He found a 6 for the second place, which yielded the interpretation: the wanderer comes to the inn. He has his possessions with him. He receives the persistent attentions of a young servant. Knecht's leave-taking went off cheerfully, except that his last talk with Tegularius proved to be a hard test of both their characters. Fritz controlled himself by extreme effort and appeared absolutely frozen in the coolness he forced himself to display. For him, the best he had was departing with his friend. Knecht's nature did not permit so passionate and above all so exclusive an attachment to a friend. If need be, he could get along without one and could direct his affections easily toward new objects and people. This parting was not a painful loss for him, but he knew his friend well enough to know what a shock and trial it meant for him, and he was concerned. He had given much thought to the nature of this friendship, and had once spoken about it with the music master. To a certain extent he had learned to objectify his own experience and feelings, and to regard them critically. In so doing he had become aware that it was not really, or at any rate not only, his friend's great talent that attracted him to Tegularius. Rather, it was the association of this talent with such serious defects, such great fragility. And he realized that the single-mindedness of the love Tegularius offered him had not only its beautiful aspect, but also a dangerous attraction, for it tempted him to display his power over one weaker in strength though not in love. Therefore in this relationship he had made restraint and self-discipline his duty to the last. Fond though he was of Tegularius, the friendship would not have acquired so deep a meaning for him if it had not taught him something about the dominion he had over others weaker and less secure than himself. He learned that this power to influence others was part and parcel of the educator's gift, and that it concealed dangers and imposed responsibility. Tegularius, after all, was only one of many. In the eyes of quite a few others necked red silent courtship. At the same time, during the past year he had become far more conscious of the highly charged atmosphere in which he lived in the glass bead game village. For there he was part of an officially non-existent but very sharply defined circle, or class, the finest elite among the candidates and tutors of the glass bead game. Now and then one or another of that group would be called upon to serve in an auxiliary capacity under the magister or archivist, or to help teach one of the game courses, but they were never assigned to the lower or middle level of officialdom or the teaching corps. They provided the reserve for filling vacancies in leading posts. They knew one another thoroughly, they had almost no illusions about talents, characters, and achievements. And precisely because among these initiates and aspirants for the highest dignities each one was preeminent, each of the very first rank in performance, knowledge, and academic